This chapter, we're going to address the overview of the history of ancient Israel. And I often use this chapter to identify traits that were common in the Middle East, the ancient Middle East, and that is the transition of populations from sort of a pastoral existence to an agricultural existence. And we know that this happened again and again throughout the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. We've talked about the Akkadians, we've talked about the Babylonians, Aramaeans. These people seem to either have migrated into the region or have been there all along, but to have been engaged as pastoralists and gradually to have assimilated the urban lifestyle of their neighbors. So it's sort of a combination of the two things. The main point I need to stress is that for these other cultures, we don't have the history of it. And maybe that's what the Old Testament provides us with. In other words, that the transition that they underwent, and they saw it in very moral terms and in very religious terms, was a transition that was acted out again and again in this region by other peoples who didn't preserve a record of it. Maybe the transition that happened to the Israelites, the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, was close enough to the time at which they started writing things down that they had a memory of it, shall we say, a better preserved memory of it. So let's just see how this plays out. In terms of the chronology, there are sort of four main periods. We have the era of the patriarchs. This is when the ancient Hebrews were a pastoral people. It was a very segmentary society, which means it was tribal and kinship based. Um, and that they migrated from Mesopotamia up into Syria and down into Canaan, and then were, according to the Old Testament, at least some of the tribes were encouraged to go into Egypt and became part of the Egyptian captivity. They were able to escape, supposedly under Moses, and they went through the desert and they got to Canaan and conquered Canaan. Or were they there all along? Again, this is we have no external sources confirm this part of it. We do have, as we'll see, records slightly afterwards that indicate that the ancient Hebrews were in Canaan by about 1200 BC, where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to be doing. In other words, there's nothing external that to disprove the tradition of the Old Testament. But bearing in mind that the Old Testament is kind of it's an argument. It is a religious argument more than a historical record. Okay. Then we have the period of Judges and the settlement of Canaan, and this is the period at which many of the peoples of these tribes assimilated agricultural existence and even urban lifestyle this way. But it still was an assembly of some 12 different tribes, independent. They fought among themselves as much as against neighboring threats. They did have an amphictyony. They had an identity, a religious complex, whether it was Shiloh or Bethel or Shechem. There was only one in which they would gather for peak festival events. And we know that by the time of the formation of the kings, they had a priestly caste. There was, in addition to the Sephites or the judges that ruled each of the tribes this way. Pressure from the outside, pressure from the Philistines and others, compelled the Israelites, the ancient Hebrews, to appoint a king. Saul became the first king, and it's important to recognize that it was not it was a selection of last resort. In other words, unlike the other cultures we've been looking at, there was no solid tradition for kingship among the ancient Hebrews. And in fact, we can see prophecy, the notion of prophet, to precede kingship and to transcend kingship. But kingship was a political decision because of the threats that surrounded them as the whole region became more urbanized and threats became part of the life. And so ultimately, King David was able to take over and consolidate power by about 1000 BC. He and his son Solomon reigned for about 80 years and brought stability, a sense of empire, since their influence extended all the way to the Euphrates in the north and all the way to Egypt and the Arabian Sea in the south. It also imposed for the first time a centralized monarchical system, including taxation, including a nationalized militia, and also urban centers, Jerusalem being the main one. And they centralized the cult. They brought in the cult of Yahweh and created the temple there, uh, and so on. So at this point, we can say Israel became a settled agricultural society with a large, at least one large urban settlement in its midst. Unfortunately, to do all this, the kings, David and Solomon, particularly the latter, had to resort to a number of unpleasant, unpopular actions. One of them was to engage in marriage alliances with neighboring kings in order to have the diplomatic and trade advantages, bringing in artisans, bringing in princesses to Jerusalem, so that it created a hierarchy in Jerusalem that was above the everyday Israelites, and yet it was foreign. And so there's a sense of xenophobia that creeps in for this, especially when you combine that with the other thing, which was forced labor. How did he build the temple? How did he build the palace complex? He built it by a Prytany system in which at least 10 of the 12 tribes had to give a month, they had to send their young men down to engage in a month of mandatory labor to build the monument. One version is that the um, tribe of David was exempt from this, and so that caused further irritation. What we know is with the death of Solomon, a civil war broke out, and the kingdom became united. The 10 tribes to the north created a separate kingdom called Israel, and they built an anti capital at Samaria, and then Judah, the southern kingdom, remained independent. It was more rural, kind of backward, but it did have the advantage of having the tradition of being the tribe of David. It had the temple. It had all the attributes of the great period, the previous period this way of Israel's greatness. And then we have to bear in mind that at this point, um, the great empires were emerging on the fringe. We hear a lot about the Assyrians in particular. And what we know is that kings like Omri and Jehu had to sort of succumb to becoming subject states of the Assyrian Empire. But like all others, they rebelled constantly and had to be punished. So we get the sack of Samaria and the crushing of Jerusalem by Sargon II in 721. BC. And then Judah continued as one of these petty states under the thumb of the Assyrians until they collapsed. Then we have the Chaldean or the Neo Babylonian Empire. Again, they had to be subservient to them. Their king was taken prisoner at one point, but ultimately Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem in 586. And kind of like what they did to Israel, they captured, enslaved the entire hierarchy of Jerusalem and brought it to Babylon. We even have the ration tablet of Jehoiakim saying this is the rations of the king of Judah, found on a cuneiform tablet in the excavations at Babylon. And so we get the Babylonian captivity. It's generally assumed that it's during this period that the Old Testament, as we know it, was formalized and came into its close to extant state, and that it, that the religion itself became sort of this closed set that it was to remain after this. With the advent of the Persian Empire, Cyrus encouraged various Jewish leaders to go back and rebuild Judah, rebuild Jerusalem. This had to go on for about 200 years. It fits and starts, but ultimately they were able to achieve this by creating a religious state, and anybody who was a citizen of the state had to prove strict descent on both sides of their family from the pre-captivity state of Judah, for example. And so we say at this point, it quit being about the ancient Hebrews, ancient Israel, and became modern Jewish history for a number of reasons. One of which is that the prophets quit speaking as well. And so there's a sense of a break, shall we say, at that point. And there's the rundown. External sources, and we're looking at this archaeologically now. External sources for this. So we have the Stele of Merneptah, dates to about 1204 BC, and there's a wall painting on the wall of the temple in Karnak, which seems to show he claims to have conducted a razzia into Canaan, and to have defeated a people he called the Israelites. The first external source, external to the Old Testament, for the existence of the Israelites. And he said he had to go into Canaan and defeat them, and if the related wall relief is correct, it shows people, a Bedouin people fighting on camels, living in tents, fitting the context that we would expect based on the Exodus in the Old Testament. We have a couple other mentions of the fact that there was a kingdom of Israel. One of them refers to, it's from Edom, and it refers to a razzia conducted by that king into the kingdom of David. So it was referred to as the kingdom of David, which means, as far as the Edomites were concerned, David was a historical person. And then later, in the period of Jehu, this is 824 BC, we have the black obelisk of Shalmaneser the third. Um, this is after a civil war, and he's trying to show his accomplishments. And it lists the various states that are paying tribute, and one of them shows King Jehu of Israel, the northern state of Israel, bowing before him and giving him tribute. So here is Jehu bowing before um, Shalmaneser and giving him the tribute. Again, so what's the point of this? Here is external information that confirms the existence of Israel at this time. It puts it in the context of one of these petty, smaller states dealing with the emergence of the great empires once again. Quickly through some of the other things, here is the site, the mound at Shiloh. Shiloh may have had a totemistic center of the Amphictyony there. In the lower corner, you can see the tabernacle, believed to be sort of an altar with where the sacred elements could be preserved. And again, one theory is when the tribes came out of Egypt, they may have introduced the Yahweh cult to the tribes that never went into Egypt and got them all to agree to this. In any event, it's clear that this was under the period of the Safites, the judges. This is this rural sort of context of coexisting tribes. And it's important to recognize that at this time, there were competing religious sort of beliefs. For example, the Baal cult, which was very common in Phoenicia and Canaan. And so, as they assimilated and coexisted with the Canaanites, they would have incorporated this. It's no coincidence that many of the kings, particularly in the northern state of Israel, the word Baal exists in their name, and Asherah as well, the consort of Baal. And again, there is a kind of fluidness to this in which even the Yahweh cult, Yahweh is associated with Asherah. So we have to understand the soup, this kind of Middle Eastern soup out of which the Yahweh cult emerged. With the rise of the United Kingdom, and we mentioned this before, one of the problems for kingship when it didn't exist, it had no army, it had no money. And so we see with David and Solomon the imposition of a centralized state, the existence of a state in that regard. And so Megiddo is important for this. To the lower left, you can see these three doorway gates. These are believed to have been treasure bases where the tithe taken, the taxes taken, could be stored locally and then used for various purposes. Some archaeologists have pointed to this as the footprint of the consolidation of the state of Israel under the and again, the other important feature, of course, is Jerusalem, which is still an extant city with population living on top of the remains. And what we know is that David, again, centralized the Yahweh cult, brought it down, and it was convenient for him that this was a former Canaanite citadel very close to the border of northern Israel. And so it was a way he could kind of keep within contact with the tribes to the north as well. But he moved the Yahweh cult here, started the construction of the temple, the palace, the citadel. On the right, you can see reconstruction of at that time. Dome of the Rock, the Great Mosque, is what we're seeing on the platform of the temple today. Just a map showing the various districts, and again, Israel, I mean, Jerusalem, of course, goes on into Christian times and Muslim times. It is a central node for at least three religions. Interesting about this, we need to stress, um, we'll get to this, but the temple, if you read the descriptions in the Second Kings, look at the ornateness to it, the mentions of reliefs and statues of cherubs, the presence of the Baal cult within it at the height. This is because the foreign intelligentsia brought its cults as well. These princesses brought their cults, their entourages, their priests, and were allowed to set up here in the capital as well. And if you were um, zealous about the purity of the Yahweh cult, as many of the reforming prophets were, you would have had a problem. Here is the remains of the excavations, was such as it was a long time ago, of Samaria, the anti-capital for Israel as opposed to Judah. One of the problems with the kings of the north is all the emblems of kingship were there in the south in Judah, and so they had to replicate that, their own sanctuary, their own capital. And as I said, Israel was more populous, so it tended to be a major player in the political world at that time and suffered the consequences with the destruction in 722, 721. And then finally, we have the Wailing Wall. This is the only surviving portion of the platform on which the temple and the palace were based. And we can see in the lower left the assault of Nebuchadnezzar against the walls. And then there is the ration tablet from Babylon mentioning King Joachim of Judah getting his ration. I'm going to stress here the whole notion of transhuman. This is an important feature. We're going to look now at cultural attributes. And herding is the dominant aspect to this. And so I'm in the mountains of Turkey. I'm up at about 5,000 feet. And here is this herd of sheep coming through the campground where we were doing our work in 2011. There's a relief down below that shows a shepherd as well. And up in the upper left, we're looking at this Yaila. This is an upland meadow at about 5,000 feet, 6,000 feet. It's above the tree line. What we know is that the grasses of these upland meadows throughout this region provide something like 4 to 5 times the nutrient that these animals will get anywhere else in their movement. And the thing about transhuman and sheep and goats is you have to move them. You have to move them from the lowlands in the wintertime, where they can eat stubble after the harvest is in, uh, up into these meadows in the summertime. You can't have them in the wintertime because this meadow gets about 3 meters of snow and it would have been blocked during the. But as soon as it's accessible, they drive their herds up there and they will use these water channels to get up there. And this is how transhumance works. Each tribe has its own sort of separate route up to the highlands. You want to get your animals up into the highlands as soon as possible, and you want to keep them up there as long as possible. This is where you grow your herd and you can clean it and what have you, and bring it back down, sell off the parts for standard meat and what have you to neighboring urban settlements. And so you have to think of herding. First of all, it's not poverty. It's very lucrative in its own way. But secondly, it is ancillary to agriculture. The herders are using the wastelands around the arable lands to further the economic base of a region. Think of it that way. So they orbit up into the hills in the summertime, down to the lowlands or the coast in the wintertime, and they exchange their resources for tools and materials that they couldn't make themselves. So we have to think about that and some of the consequences of that. And this we'll get to this. And so, what are some of the points of this? If you're going to live this way, life is very austere. Think about it this way. To feed a family of four for a year, it takes a metric ton of grain. You can't carry a metric ton up into the mountains and back down. So you can only move with what you can carry. And so minimalism, a total minimalism. These people lived in tents. They would share property, including women. When a husband dies, the brother or the cousin might take the wife, as the example of Ruth is demonstrated in the Old Testament. Um, and they had to be able, because they have to drive the animals at all times. One of the dangers here when you're dealing with scrub brush is that these animals will eat everything on the plants, and so you have to move them in order to preserve the plants. And so teams of herders will drive the animals even during the nighttime away from the camp. And so it's austere, it's individualistic. People have, if they're going to be religious, they have to have a way to worship their gods on their own. So this is a culture that does not emphasize major sacrifices, and it does not emphasize priesthood apart from sort of elders who can instruct everybody how to worship Yahweh on their own. So we think of it that way. Uh, it kind of fits in. And the one element that existed in this period of the judges, shall we say, is the existence of prophets. So prophets, this is a revelational thing. You're not really born a prophet. You are touched by Yahweh to speak his word. Various manifestations could be reflected in their speaking in tongues or going into epileptic seizures, whatever it might be. It convinced the people around you that you were speaking for Yahweh. And so this is the covenant of this particular culture. We can take it all the way back to Abraham. It was a renewing thing with Isaac and Jacob and Moses and so on. But always there are these sort of prophets that sort of led the way. We think of it that way. If we think of this minimalistic society, it migrated, it went into Egypt, came out of Egypt, and we have in the Old Testament, we should point out, the Old Testament, the assumption is that it was kind of compiled, beginning compiled, in the era of Solomon in the 10th century. And there were many, many hands, voices in the Old Testament. And one of them is one of the oldest in terms of its archaic use of Hebrew, is the Decalogue of J. If we look at the Decalogue of J, we get some interesting features to this. Thou shalt worship no other God. That doesn't deny the existence of other gods. It's saying you should worship the others. We call this henotheism, putting one God above the others, not denying their existence, but putting one above the others. They shall make no molten images. The feast of the Passover thou shalt keep. The firstling of an ass thou shalt redeem with a lamb. Of the firstborn uh, of thy sons thou shalt redeem. None shall appear before me empty. Uh, 6 days thou shalt work, but on the seventh thou shalt rest. Thou shalt observe the feast of the ingathering. Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither shall the sacrifice of the Passover remain until morning. The firstling of thy flocks thou shalt bring before Yahweh thy God. Thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk. Now, again, I'll show you in Exodus where this comes from. And some scholars have suggested that this may have been an earlier version of the Ten Commandments, a version that was applicable to a transhumant pastoral society. Notice all the references to um, animal husbandry. That's the main point I would stress there. And that the nature of prophecy, the nature of these sort of um, um, re examining the path is that you could kind of take the Yahweh cult and apply it to circumstances as they change, sort of summing up again, okay, this is where we are now. How do we address these problems this way? And you could count on the prophets to speak on this regard. Let's go on to the kingdom. We have the flow chart right here. What I stress in this flow chart is the presence of foreigners, whether it's mercenary generals, whether it's foreign princesses, whether it's artisans and traders. They're at the top of society because they were the ones responsible for constructing Jerusalem in this way. And we hear a lot about the yeoman laborers, the citizen soldier farmers who are the army, who are farming and are providing the labor of the Brittany system. And as happens when societies transit from rural, pastoral, um, even subsistence agriculture to more of a urban commercial exchange sort of economy, is that the inequalities of economic growth tend to come to the fore. Some people get wealthy faster, other people fall behind and fall into debt. And debt indebtedness, debt servitude, debt slavery is one of the harshest principles that existed in antiquity. If you could not pay your debts, you could be sold into slavery. And so there, it starts to emerge a kind of a resentment. It just keeps popping up in the tradition, a resentment of the elites. We hear about judges handing out corrupt rulings, for example, and these rulings are almost always concerned with death. We hear about orphans and widows falling through the safety net. No one's there to protect them in this new urban environment. So these are the issues that led to the divided kingdom and that led to the continually questioning of the authority of the hierarchy. By who is the question? And that's where it gets kind of interesting. Let's see if it's the next slide. Right. This is the last slide, so let me make the points here. Uh, if people had a complaint with this hierarchy, if people had a complaint with the way things are going, and again, who are the ones complaining? It's the citizen soldier farmers who are the backbone of this state. So, in some ways, what we're seeing here is a small place where people matter a lot, and so they're in a position to complain, and someone has to answer for it. The problem they had is that they couldn't necessarily complain. And what was the channels for redress? They couldn't necessarily complain to the king because the kings are the ones who created this hierarchy. They're the ones marrying all these princesses. They're the ones trying to become diplomatically connected to all the other states in this region. They're operating at that sort of intellectual, not intellectual, but elite status this way. And so the kings were not, since they were responsible for creating the problems, then they're not the ones you could access for redress. And the ones that were prophets. And so we see the emergence of what is known as the reforming prophets. These prophets who suddenly rise up and begin to speak out against the inequities and the problems that they saw all around them from the perspective of ordinary people. If you look at these prophets, Elijah, Joshua, the others, one's a cobbler, one was a butcher, one was just ordinary people who were touched by Yahweh to speak his word. Uh, and the point is that there was never any questioning of the tradition of the prophets. The prophets preceded the kings, and their authority was unquestionable vis-a-vis the kings. And so this was the channel for redress. It gave people a spigot, if you will, to express a pressure valve, to express their discontent in a ways that they could not expect support or redress from the king. And through the influence of the reforming prophets, all these changes began to occur. See in Israel after the divided kingdom, there's an argument that the elite were trying to be sort of an inclusive sort of Yahwism in which other cults could be present, but Yahweh would be the dominant cult. But the reforming prophets would have none of this, and so they actually led rebellions against Ahab and Jezebel, for example, and in the process began to cleanse the religion increasingly of all these foreign attributes that it had collected during maybe the migrations, but also more dominantly through this sort of emergence of a urban state. So what can we say about the conclusions of this experience that they had, this kind of somber experience? Uh, there are certain things that are stated here for the first time. For example, the dignity of humankind, essentially the belief that all citizens have rights. Now, we should point out by this, they mean freeborn property holding males, not women, not foreigners, not slaves, but it starts somewhere that citizens have rights that transcend the authority of kings. Secondly, a resounding denial of the divine right kings. To me, this is one of the most earth-shattering ones because it's the first culture that we've looked at here in over 1,000 years to articulate this point of view that the king's rights are not automatic and guaranteed and divinely assured by the gods. And it may not be a coincidence that this emerges with a culture that didn't have a tradition for kingship in the first place. The kingship came in purely as a political lever, not as a religious thing, although it helped that the early kings were prophets in that way. And third, and most important, the evolution, the emergence of monotheism. If you, again, think about the Ten Commandments as we know them, and we can see a kind of fully embraced urban society where they use oaths against judgment, where they own houses, and where they, do not take the Lord's name in vain. Don't swear an oath so that so and so can get ripped off in some way. And so that's part of it. But another part of it is the way in which the reforming prophets used the shadow of the developing empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, as an indication that because the ancient Hebrews were not behaving in accordance of the pleasure with Yahweh, Yahweh was using these elements to teach them his will. And so increasingly, everything became controlled by Yahweh, and a kind of monotheism starts to emerge out of this. And I should point out, we're talking about the 9th, 8th, 7th centuries BC. This is going on throughout the region. We have Zoroastrianism in the Iranian culture. We have Greek rational thought emerging in the Aegean. We have Buddhism amounting in India at this time, and Confucianism emerging in China at this time, all between the 8th and 6th centuries BC. Something seems to be in the winds that's trending toward a monotheistic point of view. Was it that cultures had rebuilt to the point where they have schools and intellectuals and thinkers that are coming up with these great ideas? Or was it that ideas are simply moving with people throughout Eurasia? In any event, we refer to this as the axial age. Okay, and so we'll leave it there.